Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Webinar Wednesday with IFDA. Our topic today is going to be Universal Design for Learning in blended and hybrid environments. A little bit of housekeeping. You should see an option today for Q&A at the top. So if you do have any questions during the presentation, please type them there. Some questions we may get to during the presentation, others we may leave for the end. We will try to answer as many of them as we possibly can. And it's also, there may be some times when I ask you to use the chat feature, but its raise hand will be disabled, as will any sort of audio. Your microphones are muted and you will be in listen only mode. Today's presentation is being recorded and it will be archived and available on the IFDA website within 48 hours. Just a little bit about me. My name is Dean Dyer. I like Dean. Should you correspond with me afterwards, just a little bit of my history so you know where I'm coming from with this. It's way back in history. I had started off to be a high school chemistry teacher, ended up doing a master's degree in instructional technology. It's because even back then, I was a big kind of geek and nerd. From there, I did do some substituting for a year and then ended up fortuitously getting an assistantship and was able to do doc work in instructional systems at Penn State University. I did leave before doing my big book report, so I am one of those perpetual ABD people out there, but I have been working in online learning for about 25 years now, from the time that I took my first distance and online course through the World Campus at Penn State. For the past 23 years, I've been employed at Jefferson Community College in Watertown, New York, which is part of the State University of New York, as the lead trainer, support professional development, system admin, all sorts of things for our online learning and our learning management system, which is currently Blackboard. As well as providing instructional design support more generically, and pretty much any sort of educational technology here on campus. Yes, we are a small school. We are transitioning right now from Blackboard to Brightspace. I really appreciated the chance to come and work on this presentation for you all here at IFDA, and it's provided me some more insight as to things that we need to think about as we move. We have 23 years of history in Blackboard, and we need to move that into Brightspace in about 6 months. So that's where we are. So a lot of what I'm doing is kind of informed by that move and what we've been doing here. And should you wish to correspond with me after this presentation, my email is ddyer@sunyjefferson.edu. Only one N there in SUNY. Though the weather today happens to be sunny, it's still relatively chilly, though not nearly as bad as that right-hand picture of what I looked like after snow blowing in the winter. So the things that we will be discussing today, we're going to talk about universal design for learning. And to do that, we're going to actually back up a little bit and talk about the idea of universal design and where it comes from, what universal design actually is and isn't. We're going to talk about the 7 principles of universal design. We're going to talk about some benefits of universal design, and of course, the important things here, what does applying universal design look like, particularly in a hybrid or blended environment, both kind of course level and program level. So, those small course things build up into bigger program things. So we will be looking at that as we go through. Okay. So to start, what is universal design for learning? So it's like many of the things that we have in education. Universal design didn't really start with us. It really was more of an environmental, architectural, civil engineering kinds of concepts, not dissimilar to accessibility. So if you're familiar with accessibility things, they are actually part of UDL, but we go beyond them. And just like that, they really kind of, the idea started as physical space. So it's the UD project, it mentions that universal design is about designing an environment to be used by as many people as possible. And here's the kicker, right? It's because, of course, we want to design things to be used by lots of people, but without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And that really kind of comes in afterwards, right? It's or we can look at that in terms of considering the diverse needs and abilities of all users, right? It's as we design. It's Allison Posey, it's kind of in that third quote, the word proactively, right? It's so the big thing here is that we are trying to use all of our knowledge and all of our skills to anticipate the needs of learners and to design our learning environments around those needs so that we don't need to change much, if anything, later on. Now, later on, we'll talk about how UDL is really a journey. It's not a destination. It's not like you can ever say, I'm done. There's always something more that you can do, more improvements. But with that said, there are some things that we can do along the way to make sure that we are developing as well as we possibly can from the very beginning. Okay. One of the big things that really stuck out for me as I was doing some more research for this, because after more than 25 years in the field of education, UDL is one of those topics that I've grown up with very organically. So there's a lot of this that I just go, yep. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I've looked a lot into the immediate research. A lot of my learning has come through presentations like this, workshops, it's short snippets of things. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was this idea of reframing the concept of disability. If you've been familiar with accessibility guidelines, it's the section 508 things in federal law. It's local state laws vary. But we want to move beyond just that idea of accessibility. But if you think about it, it's most of the time when we are dealing with accessibility issues, we are dealing with them after the fact. It's, I did this, and this thing needs to be changed for this one population. Or it's, I need to do something different here in response to the fact that now I have a student who needs this with a specific need, right? It's so tactics, and their group, it's rather than seeing the students as being incapable of participating in our courses, right? It's, we reframe the problem as our courses don't meet the needs of our students, right? And so it's not unusual in education to take that idea of meet your students where they are. And this is really just taking that a step further. Right. So the principles of universal design, and again, these come out of actual universal design, not specifically for learning, but I'll try to relate some of them that maybe don't make a natural leap. Equitable use. That one's not that bad, right? It's, we want all of our learners to be able to use or participate in our learning activities. We don't want students who can't participate, right? It's, and the participation should be as identical as possible, right? It's whenever possible. And if it isn't possible for a student to have that same learning experience, it should be as close to equivalent as possible. Right? It's flexibility in use. Right? Our learning resources, our activities should meet a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. And sometimes that can be as simple as letting students pick a topic for, it's a paper that they may need to write. Or rather than saying you're going to paint a bowl of fruit, it's to generalize that out a little bit more, to really look at your learning outcomes and say, what else could they paint other than a bowl of fruit, right? Could there be something else that they could paint, right? It's some flexibility in those outcomes and the tasks that we ask our learners to do. Right? Now, sometimes that's not possible, okay? But when possible, we should try to do that. Simple, intuitive use, okay? So it's when that comes, our goals and our outcomes and our expectations for our learners, or if you're a program director, your expectations for your instructors, right, are easily understood. Right? It's regardless of the user's prior experience or knowledge, their language skills or concentration levels. So we want to make sure that a student is in a position to be as successful as possible right from the get-go without having to suddenly say, oh, you don't know how to do that, so let's make sure, okay, so now we have to go over here. Now we have to add this piece in or that piece. So if there's a task that you need students to do, right, this could be as simple as providing instructions on using a new piece of software, right? Or, it's rather than expecting students to know APA citations or MLA or Chicago, right? It's if those are requirements in your classes, to then actually provide a resource for those, so that if a student comes in without having had that information ahead of time, they have the supports in place that they need. Right? Perceptible information. So all of their necessary information should be available to learners as early as possible, right? And regardless of their ambient environment or their sensory abilities. So it's several places we're going to talk about alternate formats and things. And some of you, if you have, again, accessibility experience or backgrounds, things like captions, right? They're required for things like video. And oftentimes we look at that as something that we are doing for hearing impaired users, but captions can help other people as well, right? It's if a student is trying to watch a video while they're commuting on the subway or the train or in a taxi, or they're it's in a noisy house in the evening, right? It's captions can still let them work on their work as they go. If a learner has English as a second language, they might be able to use those captions to help them because they read English better than they hear English, for instance. I know that after a lot of years away from my French classes, I still read a lot better than I speak. Right? So having captions on videos allows me to participate more. Right? The idea for tolerance for error, right? It's minimizing the chance for harm or unintended consequences. Right? So, it's if there's something you are doing with students physically, right? We of course want to minimize that harm. That could be giving them training on equipment so that they know how to use it safely. A Bunsen burner, a drill, right? It's whatever that happens to be. That also comes in with the simple and intuitive use, right? It's that idea of having training so that suddenly being presented with a new piece of software that they've never used before does not get in the way of them performing a learning task. Right? Low physical effort. Now, this is primarily an environmental thing. So unless you're working with a classroom, it kind of sounds a little silly. And to say low mental effort, again, seems to minimize what we're trying to do as educators here. But it's that idea of low physical effort means that we shouldn't be adding to the stress levels of our students just because, right? It's without a purpose there, and we should try to make the entire process as smooth as we possibly can, which again kind of comes into this idea of size and space for approach and use. Again, from more of a physical standpoint, I have it's a design major friend, and they've had a couple of projects that they've shared in what they're doing, and things like, it's any multi-level outdoor facility now that gets designed is probably going to have an elevator, right? Or the idea of having a ramp instead of stairs, right? It makes it more accessible to more users. So it's when we think about our learning environments in our classes and the things that we are doing, making sure that the learners have what they need to perform the tasks with as little interference as possible, right? It's what they need to do. If they need to go, it's metaphorically from A to B, it's that they know how to get there, right? It's they know where the path from point A to point B is. So a couple of things that UDL isn't, right? It's so not just for one student or demographic. We often get stuck, again, in that accessibility mindset while we're thinking of, I really want to do this video, but if I do the video, I'm going to have to do all this captioning. I'm going to have to do all of these other things. And, it's really only going to be for one student. Well, it's no. And we just talked about how that can benefit other learners as well as that hearing impaired student, sorry. And, we want to think about these things in terms of how do these pieces help everybody in our classes or in our programs at a larger scale or in our institutions. Okay? It's not dumbing things down. It's not making things more simple. We can still have our students and our learners do complex things, right? We can still hold them to high standards. It's just making sure that they have the abilities, right? And the resources and the supports from the beginning, and that they're not being just thrown in afterwards as an afterthought. It really isn't an unnecessary expense. Does UDL take a little bit longer? Does it take you a little bit more time to think? Absolutely. We're about to talk a little bit more in the benefits of why it is not an unnecessary expense or a waste of time, because it really does expand the number of learners that you can work with. It really isn't hard to learn. It's really more about a mindset of making sure that you are always taking into account as many learners as possible. Okay, so even if you are used to working with, it's very motivated students, well, what happens when you don't have a motivated student? How does that student exist in your learning environment? Okay, it's not that one final goal. This is the journey, not the destination part. So it's, again, there's always a little bit more. There's always more improvement that we can do. Are you ever going to get to a point where you can kind of stop? Yeah, probably. But it's suddenly you'll think about something, or we'll learn about a new learning characteristic, and you'll say, oh, yeah, maybe I should do this in my course, right? And it's not necessarily hard to do. Okay, again, it's mostly changing the way that you think about your learning and your learning environment and your learners. Okay? So some of the benefits of UDL, and it's on the left are some things from section 508 .gov, which again, most of us think of as accessibility, but it also covers these ideas of universal design, right? And so some of the benefits at 508 are that we can save money actually doing this, right? It's because we invest in accessible products from the start, and we don't suddenly have to add those on later, right? It's in our planning, we account for those things that we may need to do for our learners ahead of time, right? It allows us to innovate, to do new things, because we challenge ourselves to account for as many learning characteristics as possible, right? And create products for everyone, regardless of their ability levels, okay? And for us, as educators, it's the more people, right, it's that we can reach out to, I think the better off we are, our programs are, right? It's our institutions are. And this can also help you engage your staff, right? It's inside your programs. Again, it can be a way for you to reinvigorate some of your instructors if you are program directors, right? And pave the way for more people with disabilities. Now, this again is one of the things, it's universal design as a whole. Again, we aren't focused specifically on people with disabilities, but this does help us prepare a wider portion of the population to actually join the workforce. So there are those advantages, okay? It's Allison Posey. We've already seen her name once before in the presentation. We'll hear it probably a couple more times. She works with an organization called CAST, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But she lists out several benefits of universal design for learning. She is very specifically looking at UDL and being inclusion. So we're able to bring in more users, right, of different learning characteristics and have them work together. Right? UDL helps create expert learners. And as we look through the CAST framework, we'll see how that ends up working. So it's those ideas of mastery learning, right? If you're familiar with that term, okay? We want our learners to become self-sustaining, lifelong learners, right? I certainly hope you have a little educational jargon bingo card going, because we'll hit a lot of them today, right? We want to change the environment, not the students. Again, we adapt our environment, whether it's our physical classroom or whether it's our online environment. We adapt that to meet the needs of the students. We don't try to change the students to meet the needs of our class, right? And of course, this is about removing barriers to learning. So those are our benefits. And moving into kind of another way to think about the principles of universal design for learning, there is an organization called CAST. If UDL sounds like something that continues to interest you, if you're going to continue to use it, I highly recommend going to their site. Lots and lots of resources, lots of material, lots of background to work with. And so they basically CAST, which originally was the Center for Applied Special Technology, which is a mouthful and hard to remember. So now they just go by CAST. Okay. So CAST developed a framework for universal design for learning, and they basically break it down into three areas. Engagement, which is really why do students learn? Okay, so we're dealing with issues of motivation, right? Connectedness, context, okay, that we work with, okay? Representation, which is really how, it's our materials and our environment and how or what are students learning from. So this is kind of our materials and our environment setup. And then lastly, action and expression. How do learners show us that they are learning? Okay, it's not terribly different if you've done it's anything in instructional design or even traditional lesson planning. These are things that we think about. And so then they continue to build these three concepts into three different levels: access, build, and internalize. And what that ends up looking like is this matrix. Okay, so at each of these levels, so access is just beginning the students out, and then how do they build on those, right? And so for instance, in engagement, we first recruit their interests, and whether you're doing advanced organizers, whether you're working with Keller's ARCS model for motivation, or other kinds of techniques to get students interested in learning. Now working with adults, you are probably getting some slightly more self-driven learners, but that's not always the case. So how do you get them into learning? And then once they start, how do they continue to learn, right? Is sustaining that effort and persistence. And then finally, how do they become self-regulating? So how do they move from not really knowing much about something to being able to now make decisions about what's the next thing that I should learn? Where's my next step to go? Without you as the instructor or the educator actually being involved necessarily even in that process, other than to go, good job, right? It's that idea creates an expert learner, right? It's who is purposeful and motivated, right? And again, our buzz term, right? It's lifelong learner. Right? It's that person who can identify things that they need to know, figure out how they're going to learn about it, and then go out and continue to doing it. Okay? So it's at the access level under representation, right? It's perception. This is just how can I give them different materials? How do we kind of build on that with languages and symbols, and developing people the proper terminology to use, right? It's moving from novice to expert, right? It's one of the biggest things that changes is the language that we use and how we use it. So how do we progress that? And then how do we finally, right? It provides some options for comprehension, right? So back to the beginning, how do we link things together? How do we support the student in linking their prior knowledge to new knowledge and then extend it into new things so that they can become resourceful and knowledgeable? And this is one of probably the biggest things that I'm seeing right now is the change that is going through this. Primarily still right now at the K-12 levels, it's starting to hit. It's in the college levels more and more. And I think it's definitely going to become more common in adult education as well, if life expectancy starts going back up. To that idea of, again, being able to find information when you need it, right? It's probably one of the biggest differences today, if somebody were to come back from the 1950s, is it's, yes, I have a computer in my pocket that can access pretty much the sum total of human knowledge. And so it's, I have information. Information is no longer something that we need to memorize and have, it's it in our heads. It's something that we need to know how to go out, get, and then analyze it and figure out how we can use it. So that's making students that way. Now, action and expression is one of the things that probably it can be one of the harder things to do, but also it's for me as an instructor as well. I teach classes for a few colleges, including my home one. I teach web page design. I teach a digital media and society course. I've taught, it's lots of teacher education courses through the years. And I'll teach almost anything else you ask me to, actually. But action and expression, how do students show you that they can meet your learning outcomes, right? It's, do all of your students write the same paper year after year after year? Wow, is that fatiguing, right? It's to you as the instructor, right? How else could they show you that, right? And that can come down to, it's if a student is taking, say, a technical writing class, as well as desktop publishing or maybe online publishing or web design class, instead of a print brochure, let them do a web page, right? Just, it's small little tweaks like that, letting students pick their own topics, right? It's within the bounds, right? It's, you can still have outcomes that they need to meet, right? It's, you can still have your learning objectives, but it's, let them figure out how to meet those objectives, right? That requires a whole different order of learning and understanding on their part, right? And that helps them understand and learn to be strategic and goal directed, okay? Again, great, highly recommend the CAST website. This particular framework is at the udlguidelines.cast.org, and they do have a ton of downloads available for you as resources. That bottom row, those expert learners, right? It's the idea that our courses and our programs helps build learners into expert learners, right? Maybe not experts in the topic, discipline, or field, but that they actually can be successful in the course and with the concepts, the ideas, the skills inside the course, right? And so those courses and programs that tend to build towards those expert learners have some common characteristics, right? First off, all learners know what the goal is. They know what the outcome should be, right? Whether that is, it's finding, organizing, and presenting data, right? Whether that is learning how to, it's properly construct a retaining wall, right? It doesn't matter what the outcome actually is. They know where they are headed and what that ends up looking like, or where the flexibility in what that looks like is, right? Which are the intentional flexible options for all students. Students accessing resources from the start, right? This says of a lesson, right? It's so whenever it is appropriate. And so it's so as soon as you're asking them to do, again, let's just use citations as an example. As soon as they have to do citations, you should have resources ready for them about doing citations, whether that's an actual lesson that you do, or whether those are other institutional or it's freely available web resources like Purdue's OWL site. It's having those available as the students need them, right? It's that just-in-time instruction idea, right? And students building and internalizing their own learning. So again, letting them make choices when it makes sense, right? Now, obviously, if I'm teaching about chemical reactions, that may not be a safe thing for students to do. So that may have a little less flexibility than, say, a research paper about American history, right? We have a lot of American history, and you can see a lot of different ways to put that sort of information together, from, it's a traditional research paper to a PowerPoint presentation, right, to a web page, to, right, an award-winning Broadway musical, right? There are all sorts of ways for students to, express, it's their ability to meet your learning outcomes there, right? And we did have a question, and some people in the chat are helping out. Yes, you will get copies of this presentation. There's also a handbook that goes along that we'll talk about at the very end. So that will be there, and you will be able to get those afterwards. Okay. So as we switch into the how do we actually do this, because very specifically, I was asked to share some ideas for blended or hybrid environments. And so I just want to make sure that we are on the same page when we talk about blended and hybrid environments, because as I work with colleagues across SUNY and go to conferences, it's not everybody necessarily means the same thing by those two words. So very generically, I will be using that term blended or hybrid to mean there is some asynchronous part of the course, right? It's so no meeting time, right? It's students have the ability to work on things at their own timing, not necessarily their own pace, but it's not Tuesday afternoon at 2 when they have to do this work, right? And then some synchronous time, right? It's so traditionally that was classroom time. And realistically, the class and the instructor are all in the same space at the same time. So that part of the course is Tuesday afternoons at 2. Right? Of course, online learning and especially COVID showed us that that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be in the same physical space. We can actually engage remotely with our students, very much like we're doing now. It's only with hopefully a little more interactivity normally. But that idea of using Zoom or some other webcasting kinds of technology to put us in kind of together at the same time. The web class that I teach right now is fully synchronous, but we have both remote and local students. So I have students who meet with me in the classroom, and then we also have a Zoom connection going. And so we have a special room for that so that we can be more immersed together, those two different groups. Okay. It's a hybrid, I think before it was actually hybrid, right? We had this idea of the flipped classroom. So instead of the instructor going over content during class when we're together and then having students do homework, right? It's when they were on their own, we started using teachers a little more effectively to say, okay, if you've got a textbook, read it. Or if you've got these outside resources, use those to learn the content. And then we're going to take our time when, it's our instructors who are knowledgeable, right? Who know how to help you really learn how to apply these things and use that time, right? We call that the flipped classroom. And of course, now one of the big new things is high flex learning, which really has options for remote synchronous, classroom synchronous, or asynchronous online, and learners can flip back and forth. So it's, if we happen to be talking this week about the Civil War, students could be either live in the classroom with me, they could be remote, or maybe they choose to do everything completely online, either through recorded lectures, other materials that might go over the same sort of material that is in the lecture, those sorts of things. Now, we aren't really talking high flex. We are really kind of talking either students are together at the same time, or they have activities that they can do asynchronously, right? But all of these modes really have challenges of time and space. Right? When can students participate? Where are they when they participate? And of course, we know with adult learners, those requirements, right? It's that they have, right? It's still being available for their families, right? It is always a big sort of thing, right? And not being able to get someplace. Maybe the only place that I can actually take this class in person is 60, 70, 100 miles away. I live in a very rural part of New York State. Our college campus is the only college campus for roughly 70 miles in any direction. So, it's even though we are a community college, we have partnered with other schools. to make sure to bring in more bachelor's, master's, and we've even had doctoral programs taking place here on campus, so that people can kind of continue their career journey and their learning here locally, right? Taking care of some of those challenges, right? So programs, and this is where, if you could, if you can open up that chat area, right? I would be interested to hear some of the things in your programs, or even down to the course level. What are some of the barriers that you know your students have? What affects their ability to successfully complete your courses and your programs? Nobody wants to go first. All right. Well, yeah, it's again, we've talked about some of those barriers, right? English is a second language, right? It's time constraints, distance constraints. It's maybe, and especially again, with some older adults who might be retraining, right? It's, oh, thank you very much, right? It's prior knowledge can be restricted, okay? Due to family and financial dynamics, right? It's socioeconomic status. We know that that's a big predictor of success in our programs, right? It's somebody may have been working a factory or a manufacturing job for 30 years and gets laid off and needs to retrain, right? And they've never had to interact with computers. So it's learning issues. Would love to hear a little bit more, but yes, it's reading, right? It's issues like dyslexia can drastically affect students, right? It's those time constraints, right? It's students who are trying to do coursework and do a job, and right, it's still interact with family, perhaps, right? It's all of those sorts of issues, because it's one of the things that I often say to my students: life happens, right? It's kind of the other side of the Jurassic Park, life will find a way. Well, yes, it will. I have one student right now who just went to the ER on the final day of class before they could turn in their final project. So how do you work with that? How do you make your class upfront flexible and let them know that there is flexibility for things like that? Language, convinced they are dumb, right? I get that so much. One of the classes I taught was in environment and energy course. And it's probably the best feedback that I have ever gotten from a student is, I am no longer scared of science, right? Full stop. Cultural differences, absolutely. And you never know when those come up. It's needing glasses or hearing issues, right? And so some of those, can be both the disability side of things. Some of that might just be, again, a socioeconomic sort of thing of they need a pair of glasses, right? And is your institution able to help them or point them in the right direction to get those, right? And how does that show up in your course at the course level when a student interacts with your group, your organization, your institution? How does that actually show up in the course? Executive functioning, I am seeing that more and more in my students. Students coming in who need accommodations. It's students. I also deal with a large military population where we are. So it's especially as the Afghan and Iraqi wars were kind of wrapping up, we're seeing more and more traumatic brain injury coming through, and students just having problems, right? It's trying to make decisions about what happens. It's outside of kind of our more traditional learning where we think about things like ADHD, but it's when you get somebody who is, it's been blown up 5 times, it's that becomes an issue. So it's kind of the last one in the list, and then we're going to kind of flip this. It's my gender does not do this. Yeah, right. It's and that again are those cultural sorts of things that we can get into. So now, right, it's how do you mitigate those, right? It's transportation issues. Well, it's in some places, maybe, your institution can make, its agreements for bus passes, right? And those sorts of things. It's, the prior exposure to technology. Maybe even if in your blended program, most of it is online, maybe you have a couple of sessions where what you're working on, are face-to-face skills about how to use the technology. Because it's, if I think about my parents, right, who are baby boomers, it has required an awful lot of hand-holding to get them to the point of anything close to, right? It's a modern use of technology, and still getting them to use their cell phone is almost impossible, right? It's self-efficacy skills. Oh, great one, right? It's how do you support that inside of your class, right? Well, we need to let them make small decisions first, right? It's help them learn that pattern of being able to make decisions in low stakes, it's areas ahead of time, right? It's lots of small little things to build up to. Okay. Young students bullying older students. Absolutely, especially over things like lack of technology knowledge, right? It's and likewise, right? It's older students sometimes bullying younger students about, it's we hear all the time, nobody wants to work, or it's you guys are lazy, you don't have any loyalty, it's those sorts of things. Well, the truth is things are different, generations change. So how do you support that in your programs, again, to be proactive, not reactive? Okay, it's so it's what decisions can you make, right? That could be a program-wide or an institutional-wide civility policy or statement. Okay, it's how do we expect you, right? It's again transparency, setting clear expectations for your learners of how they are to behave with each other, right? And why do we have those expectations for behavior, right? And again, we want to be intentional about this. We don't want to stumble into something just because we're lucky. Okay. So a few of the things here, it's in moving those issues into our courses, into our programs, right? It's consistency across courses. If all of your information for your courses are always put together the same way, so that if a student takes an English class and then moves to a history class, moves to a pottery class, moves to, it's whatever, the classes are going to be built the same, right? They get the same types of course information and information on the syllabus. All of our syllabi have been undergoing review and being put into a new standardized template here at my home school, right? And that's all part of a very intentional process so that students don't have to try to figure out from class to class, where do I find this, right? It's what, it's this instructor called it this, that instructor called it that, this, I'm not sure what that is, right? Content and activities in the same place across courses. So it's as we are moving over, we're taking kind of our old template that we have right now in Blackboard on the left, right? And we're trying to figure out, do we want it to look the same way? Should we change it up a little bit? But you can see just as my course comes over, it's the same basic things, right? It's, I have my module overview area, right? It's, hey, this is what this area is about. In this case, about chapter 2. This is what content you get. This is what you need to do. And here's where you can ask questions, right? It's, those things are consistent within our courses. It's, you know, whether you call them mini lectures or content, right? It's, you know, that's a little less important. You know, it's, this is stuff for you to learn from. This is how you tell me what you've learned, okay, whatever that happens to be. And yes, Canvas, Moodle are probably the other two big ones out there in the space, but there are tons of other, it's smaller independent LMSs as well. Clarity, we've touched on this a lot, but our expectations for students, whether it's how they behave, whether it's the level of work, whether it's time commitments, right? You know, it's in traditional education, K-12, or, you know, it's higher ed, right? It's, everything is kind of tied to the Carnegie unit. And so, you know, it's, we have to be able to support that when our accrediting institutions come in. You know, it's for us here, that's middle states. So we've got to be able to show that students are doing a particular amount of work that kind of meets that expectation. So, you know, it's, how do we get that across to our students, you know, what we expect. Evaluation, do your students know just how they're going to be evaluated? Is it a surprise when they suddenly lose half credit for, you know, it's this thing that they weren't even thinking about, right? Again, clarity in those. Some of the ways that you can do that, right? It's templates at the course level, templates, you know, it's boilerplate inside of the course template to kind of show and model for your instructors the types of things that you want them to do. This is just a quick example of kind of some course expectations boilerplate or example and modeling that we have for instructors to put in their course expectations document, right? It's so to include their instructor specific expectations and criteria. And then it lists off a whole bunch of stuff. And then it says, put that in there and then remove the text. Okay. So if you want your instructor, if you want your students to do it as an instructor, you need to do that as an instructor. If you want your instructors to do it, then you need to do it as a program. If you want your programs to do it, you need to do it as an institution. Okay. And transparency. No mysteries. Again, this is in the clarity. Explain your choices. Why are you making them do this, right? It's the answer to the age-old question of, when am I ever going to do this, right? It's in real life. Okay. Right. Explain where there's room for change. Okay. Is there room for change? Again, sometimes there will be, sometimes there won't be. I was taking a learning theories class. It's back in my doc work. And we had gotten really, really super tired of writing these 3 to 5 page papers every week on, you know, it's the learning theory of the week kind of sort of thing, sometimes 2 or 3 of them even. So instead, we asked our instructor if we could do a television show. And so what we did is we took 4 different learning theories. 2 group members took each learning theory, pretended to be students in an educational system that was built on that particular learning theory. And then we did kind of a question and answer Saturday morning public television kind of setup to answer questions about those, right? We learned way more than we ever did, because in order to put that together, we had to learn very deeply about each of those, right? And what questions can bring those out. So where is there room for change? How can we, you know, express things maybe in a different way? Okay. And what happens where? What happens in the classroom or when you're together synchronously versus what is happening in your asynchronous online section? Okay, we've got just a couple of more couple more minutes, couple more slides, and I apologize. I wanted to leave more time for questions, but we had some good interaction in the middle, so I'm still fairly happy. Availability, what resources do students have? What resources are allowed, right? It's, can they use their books during quizzes, right? Can they use the web during quizzes, right? It can be a double-edged sword there. My webpage class, everything is open book, because as I work as an actual web person in my job, I have resources. I can pick out that book on my shelf, or I can look up that online resource, to get, what's the latest way this is being done, right? It's what new thing has been added that I can now use, right? It's some things that makes less sense to be able to do. I don't want my paramedic to have to look up everything, right? Make resources available to students early. Okay, we talked about that. Varying levels, right? You may get students who come in with less prior learning, less experience. They might be doing a wide career change rather than kind of a narrow, somebody might be coming in and needing to learn it's office skills when they've been on a manufacturing line. Right? It's versus the person who has been doing kind of sales, retail, customer support coming into an office environment, right? It's those two steps are different things. So how do you make sure that you are set up to handle both of those learners from the very beginning? Right? Of course, accessibility is a major part of this and is kind of a foundation level of things. And again, multiple formats available. One of the tools that I absolutely love in both of our LMSs is a product called Ally, which allows students to take any of the, most any of the content that is in one of our courses and change formats. So if a student needs to hear it, but you have, it's a Word document or a PDF there, they can actually ask for an audio version of that, and then they can listen to it as well, even if they don't necessarily have text to speech on their computer. Right? Support, make sure support is there, right? Make sure it is clear how students get their support. How do they learn that new technology, right? It's making sure that there is training available for them, whether it's part of the class or outside of the class, but making sure that it is very readily available to students. Can they review other classes as they do your class, right? Can they go back and look at, it's their research composition class when they're taking your history class, right? Do they have the opportunity to refresh their skills? So if you're suddenly asking them to do a research paper after a long time, right? Possibly decades from the last time that they've done that, is there a way for them to structure and to relearn those things? Right? Lastly, the handbook. It's part of your materials will be this set of slides. Part of it will be a handbook. The handbook that accompanies this it goes over some of the same basic overview of UDL and things, and then rather than try to actually give you a complete new guide, the Justice Institute of British Columbia has a great guide for applying universal design for learning, and they do several different levels, synchronous, asynchronous, blended. So I use that to actually run through and explain how to do that in the handbook. So you'll get that as part of your course presentation materials as well. Lastly, some references for you. And of course, we will be looking for your feedback. So please, you should be seeing a survey popping up on your screen. Please give IPDE your feedback on that. And of course, we encourage you to keep coming and to register and tune in for the next webinar Wednesday, which will be next Wednesday, May 17th, again at 3 p.m. Using labor market data to teach, market data tools to educate students on career opportunities. I hope you enjoy your day. And if you have any questions, please use my email and send them along. And have a great afternoon, everybody.